When we see the big picture, we can see God's grace all around us. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he makes the case that everything we have is a gift from God. He teaches that everyone is given a variety of gifts and abilities from God. And these are all for the common good. But in order for us to recognize those gifts, we need to see with eyes of faith, with new insight. We need to see the bigger picture. This week in our book study, Pastor McLaren presents 4 spheres in which we interact with, and each of them help us to see the bigger picture. The first is our personal sphere, our individual sphere. This involves the 100 trillion among the 86 billion brain cells that we have. Think about that for just a moment. In our brain, we have 86 billion neurons or brain cells. And those cells are interconnected with each other, and there are 100 trillion interconnections among them. All of that constitutes how we think, our memories. Our brain helps us to see things from the perspective of survival, our reflexes, our need to feed, fight, flight, freeze, flock, or mate. But our brains are also capable to see another sphere, the social sphere. We see things from the perspective of our families, our friends, our communities, cities, country, and internationally. For example, this week, as you know, premiers and the Prime Minister met to consider the needs of our country, Canada, in the face of the incoming President Trump's tariffs. When we hear this news, we primarily think socially about our nation. We aren't thinking so much personally or individually about how that will affect us. But most Canadians are concerned about us as a collective. The third sphere in which we see is through our biosphere. Every human society is part of a larger community of living things. When those who deeply care about the earth think about their actions as having ripple effects to future generations and to all living things on earth, then we see from the perspective of the biosphere. This week, I listened to one of my favorite CBC radio programs called Under the Influence with Terry O'Reilly. Has anyone heard that show before? Yeah. In this week's episode, he talked about last chance tourism. In this type of tourism, people are going to sites that may no longer exist because of climate change and are now more accessible to us. He points to an idea in human psychology which marketers tap into, which compel us to act because it only lasts for a limited time. How many of us have heard that phrase, buy it while supplies lasts? That phrase causes our individual sphere, our brains, to act based on survival. And so many people in this last chance tourism act on that fear. Unfortunately, many instances of last chance tourism end up actually speeding the climate change that's causing that site to disappear. O'Reilly mentions visits to the Columbia ice field, the polar bears in Churchill, Manitoba, and cruises through the Northwest Passage in the Arctic as examples. Tourists from around the world are spending tens of thousands of dollars and emitting tons of carbon into the atmosphere. But he also mentions a last chance tourism that can help the environment. Many tours in, for example, Australia's Barrier Reef are eco-friendly, from accommodations to educating and empowering tourists to protect the reef. In a way, these tourists see things from the perspective of the biosphere. They appreciate that their actions have consequences on the wildlife they are visiting. And so tour operators capitalize on this by offering eco-friendly options. So we have the individual sphere, we have our social sphere, and then our biosphere. The fourth is the geosphere. When we see this way, we come to see our actions as having consequences on the earth itself, like the Columbia ice fields. The acidification of the oceans are deteriorating soils and depleting aquifers. This week in our book study, someone had lamented the state of South Cooking Lake, which neighbors the Camp Van Ness. Perhaps if we thought from the perspective of the biosphere, we would think twice about our overconsumption, which has indirectly hastened the recession of the lake. In his book, Pastor McLaren makes that case that for too long we have seen everything from the perspective of our rose-colored glasses of human progress. We become blind to see things from the bigger picture. I would add yet another sphere through which we see. It's the sphere in which Paul infers in the letter to the Corinthians. As Christians, we're called to see that through the spiritual sphere, when we see with eyes of faith, we come to see things as God sees things, that we are blessed abundantly. Paul writes, "To each is given of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing, to another the work of powerful deeds, to another prophecy, to another discernment of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues." Paul says to us, all of these gifts are activated by one and the same Spirit, which allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. So that we don't know what the Holy Spirit gifts each and every one, but we must, with eyes of faith, recognize them. Paul is writing to the Christians in Corinth, many of who believe that their material possessions were solely because of their own doing, not of God's. But when we see how abundantly God blesses everyone as the Spirit chooses, then we don't need to be greedy or fearful that we don't have enough. This greed and fear have justified human progress, which has been for good. But as we are coming to see more clearly, our human progress has come with great cost in our economic instability around the world, our fragmenting world with shifts in politics and ecological collapse, which has caused for many migration due to climate catastrophes. We can become paralyzed in this state of doom and gloom, but the Holy Spirit empowers each of us with the ability to see the big picture, to see, as the psalm proclaims, that God's steadfast love endures forever. The Holy Spirit also empowers us with the wisdom to know what needs changing in our lives and the courage to do it. You might recall Pastor McLaren reminding us that there is no such thing as future, just a series of nows. And so, how you act now has great ripple effects around the world and generations from now. When we see the bigger picture from beyond our individual, social, bio, geo, and spiritual spheres, we find a gracious and loving God. May we open our eyes, the eyes of our hearts and minds, to see the bigger picture, to see as God sees. I invite you now into a few moments of silence, listening to the Holy Spirit stirring in your hearts, minds, and bodies.